Hi, my name's Dave Crawley, so I'm heavily involved in the arts in Liverpool. I've taught for 10 years and I'm setting myself up as freelance artist, so this is directly to Paul. You say with kids and creativity, what are your feelings with national curriculum and the way it stands at the moment?
I really told that story in relation to how we think about our world around us, and that sometimes we can move ourselves into patterns of thinking, and we need to break out of those. So it's not really for me to think about the national curriculum in this particular environment, but much more to think about how will we tackle the problems in front of us? Will we tackle them the way that we've always tackled them? Or perhaps, as Peter suggests, we can think a little bit differently. If we continue to tackle planning problems right with what's in front of us, we'll have a certain kind of answer. But if we can stop and tackle some of those problems thinking about 50 years from now, we'll have a different kind of answer. So that was really what that tale was about.
Okay, thanks, David. Do you want to come and ask over there? Were you next?
Hi there, my name is Brian Davis. I'm a Scouser, but moved away from Liverpool in 1984, my wife and I, by British Telecom, and we live in the Ribble Valley. I'd like to tell you about an experience of being a Scouser elsewhere and meeting people who've been to Liverpool who, 4 or 5 occasions, people have said to me, the people in Liverpool, when we visited, were so friendly. 100% of the people that's told me that. I think it's such an important factor. And I remember as a young man, when I lived in Liverpool, you catch a bus, you talk to strangers on the bus. You go on the London Tube and try and talk to somebody, and oh boy, just watch out, because you'll be in trouble. Now, I think that's a major factor in this livability. And I think if we could understand that more, I think it's a major asset for Liverpool. In particular, I hear that we are the 3rd most visited city in the United Kingdom after London and Edinburgh. I hear also, and I think it was the Lonely Planet or the Lonely Planet or Rough Guide said that Liverpool is the best city in the world to visit. So all I'm saying is this something we should try and understand more about the Scouse psyche and how we can actually use it more? Thank you.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with any of that, really. I think that also does reflect that this beauty is in the eye of the beholder thing. I mean, people, come to Liverpool and they love Liverpool. Liverpoolians are very friendly. I'm from Birmingham, so I disagree. I think Birmingham is the best place in the world. But Birmingham in that same Rough Guide thing scored very poorly and was apparently it's an awful place. It never really does very well in any of these rankings. But additionally, I actually live in London, and I know exactly what you mean. The further away from London you go, the more friendly people generally are. And it's a shame that we can't really account for this sort of friendliness and unfriendliness factor in livability. But it does really reflect that a lot of these factors that people really do account for when they're looking at quality of life and livability, they're very subjective, and they're also very emotive, and they're things that are real touch points for people. And they're very difficult to actually measure. So Liverpool might be the best city in the world to visit, but unfortunately, because of the livability, we couldn't say it has the fewest challenges. It's not the least worst, if that's a sufficient answer.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. Anybody else want to ask a question? Would you like to work your way around and then join the queue? Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Roger Hill. I specialise in diversity, I guess. One of the things that's missing from the livability survey for me is what I'm going to rather provocatively call the Darwinian factor, which is this business about adaptation, which is that if you come to live in a city or if you live there a long time, you have to have a certain something about you. Now, I was reading recently the book about Istanbul by the Nobel Prize winner Orhan Pamuk, and he identifies a quality called something like huzun, which is a kind of cheerful fatalism, and you have to have that cheerful fatalism to live in Istanbul, otherwise you just can't cope. And there are some places which have got inordinately long commutes, and these cities have developed, the people who live there have developed a monumental patience. And if you live in Liverpool, you've got to have a sense of humour. So whatever the particular adaptive quality is you need to live in a city, it's the thing that keeps people there, but it also changes the people when they're there. And there's a cost to it. I mean, just to put no finer point on it locally, that sense of humour comes at some psychological cost, because it's quite often self-denigratory. So my point really is, and I'll ask the panel, anybody who wants to comment on it, that actually when you ask about livability, you're asking two things really. First of all, you're asking, what is the cost of living in a city? What is the psychological, personal, physical cost of living in that city? And is it sustainable? And the second thing is it acquirable? Is it something that somebody coming to live in the city could acquire easily and be pleased to have acquired? Because if you bring a psychologist to bear upon some of these qualities that people have developed to live in their cities, then you will find that actually in some cases they have become, as I say, fatalistic, stoic, and not developmental. In some cases, a challenging city is a city that asks you to change, and asks you to change in ways that will benefit you and benefit the people around you. So the fact that a livable city is a place that doesn't have any challenges is a quite frightening thought to me, because that's the way in which we all settle down into non-development as human beings. So give me a challenging city any time, and as to whether or not the cost of living in this city or any other city is what psychological cost it is, I think that has to be factored into that before anybody can say whether or not we live in a livable city.
I think that's a really fascinating point. I think it links in with the previous question. I think you can't escape the economic and social history of a city, and I think what has contributed to the decline of Liverpool, we need to be turning around so that it contributes to our success. If you look around this notion about Liverpool, I do believe Liverpool is a very different city and is quite a friendly city as well. If you look around some of that and where the visitor economy is developed in Liverpool, we've gone in about 20 years from having absolutely no tourist economy whatsoever to being the third most most visited city in the UK, and we want to build on that. I think if you look at some of the assets and attributes we've got as a city to develop that, I'd say one is about globalization. As a city, because of our history, we get globalization, but also I think where we've come from, and this whole thing about we are quite a friendly city with a sense of humour, because we've been quite fatalistic maybe in the past about where we've been, again is something that we are trying to build on. So one of the things we've done with IFB is we've invested very, very heavily in training amongst any tourist-facing staff, whether it's taxi drivers, whether you work in one of the bus companies, whether you work for one of the hotels. We've invested very, very heavily over the last 3 or 4 months around looking at customer experience and what added value we can give on that. It has to be distinctive, because I think we want people to come to Liverpool and have a distinctive Liverpool experience, and I hope that we are there, and I hope that it's something we build on.
Great, thanks Roger for that really good question and comment, and Nick as well for his response.
Hi, my name is Diana. I live in the city for 8 years now. And before we came here, we had not really the option, we were sent here, but there was the other 3 options were Dublin, Prestwick and Rome. And my question goes to Alex, because had I asked 100 people, most of them would have said go to Rome or Dublin. The least people would have said go to Prestwick. But if you listen to prejudice and reputation around the UK and beyond, people have an image of Liverpool that's quite old-fashioned. It's not up to date anymore unless they've been here within the last 10 years. So my question, you said we have to look at how people from the outside look in and what they think about the city. So I wanted to challenge that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, what I was actually saying was that the indices that exist that record perception of people who live within cities, do that because that's part of their statistical makeup. That's what they're designed to do. But because we're in a particular situation where we've lost so much population in Liverpool, and if an objective of policymakers is to repopulate the city centre and parts of the city more widely, which clearly it is, then we probably need to address that wider impression of what the city's like, which I agree with what you've just implicit in what you just said, which is that it's erroneous, it's not true, it's not the image of the city which people outside it may have, it may not match the reality. So but to challenge it effectively, we would need to know, what the image was that we were challenging. It's that know your enemy thing, basically, isn't it? So, and it relates to some of the comments that others have made as well here about, trying to capture what the actual character of a place is in a qualitative sense. That's what the Economist Intelligence Unit really designed to do in this particular index, is to capture qualitative variables about what a place is like. It relates to the previous comment about, Liverpool being a friendly place, or New York being an aggressive place, or Los Angeles being, bonkers, or whatever. Or we could characterize anywhere on, a kind of instinctive or intuitive understanding of what it's like. But what the indices are seeking to ultimately get at is something quasi-objective. So if there is a wider perception that there's, that you should have chosen Rome over Liverpool, then we'd need to know what it was, first of all, that the wider perception, erroneous as it might be, of Liverpool was. I guess that's all I was trying to say.
I just wanted to turn the question back on you, just a wee bit in the same way that Alex just did, and that's that, now we're sort of talking about Liverpool, and I think that part of this event was to talk about quality of life, and particularly quality of life in city centres. And I wonder, what were the factors that you were looking at when you made those decisions?
We didn't have the choice. We were sent here, but we chose to stay rather than going to somewhere in Spain. And before we lived close to London, well, people who would live there would say they live in London. And for us, the livability in this place is far greater than it could ever be in London. Every time we go to London, it's probably about twice a year, I'm glad to be back home. And at the moment, I couldn't imagine living anywhere else because this place is exciting. It has lots of things I complain about. Jerry will know this. But as a city with the people and places, it's a great place to be. And just add a little thing to Peter, who said something about sexy cities. I'm originally from Berlin, and our mayor said once, we're poor but sexy, but I still chose to live here. Thank you.
Okay. We'll take a couple more questions. Anybody else? Oh, you're joining the queue. Okay, thank you.
I'd just like to start by saying thank you to John and to the panellists for an interesting evening. But even more, I think, to the people that have asked questions, because I think the questions have been really fantastic. And I'd particularly like to thank our specialist in diversity, who I can't see here now, I think made a fantastic point. Absolutely great. I think there really is an issue in terms of judging livability in terms of lack of challenge, and it's a really important psychological issue. I should have said, sorry, I'm a psychologist. I'm also lead for health and wellbeing in the university's Heseltine Institute. So part of how we function as human beings is to do with how we deal with uncertainty and how we meet challenges, and to strip that away is a dangerous thing to do. I completely agree with that. But actually the question I wanted to ask was in relation to the use of, I think, fairly widely available statistics around things like mental health and well-being. I would have thought that those kinds of quantitative statistics would tell us probably much more about livability in a city than anything that a qualitative survey might, slightly provocative, but a qualitative survey might tell us. John, I'd like you to respond.
Well, that's kind of a quite difficult area to cover because, I mean, essentially, you think that there might be lots of qualitative statistics around, like areas like mental health, etc. But we're doing a survey where we have cities like Damascus and Nairobi and Lagos. Now, in some of these locations, they wouldn't even accept that these are considered to be medical problems, let alone have statistics on them. So I think that in one respect, gathering that data would be very, very hard to do. Although you do make a good point about, I mean things like, even if we term them differently, we could score on things like optimism and outlooks and, you know, how people are feeling. And you can also get metrics on that anyway. I mean, if you were to use social media consensus and things like that, you could certainly get a vibe of how happy a city is. Now, I think that that's definitely important and true, but it's kind of not livability, because that does reflect how good a city is. That does have a view of something that's intangible that a city offers. And when you're talking about the intangibles, then you're going down that route towards what a city offers and towards how good a city is and what the best city is. And then suddenly you're going into an area where there is a degree of subjectivity. I mean, there are probably, I mean, I would definitely say we actually run a separate survey, a country-based survey, called the World Quality of Life Index, and that is designed to assess a life satisfaction index. So that looks at how happy people might be, how happy populations might be, and that to use its metrics for measurement, that measures things like, you know, like take-up of religion, church attendances, divorce rates, and a number of other factors, including the weather and the economy, to try and gel together how a society might be happy. I think there's definitely merit to that, but I also think that there's significant flaws in it as well, because if you look at the data that it might gather, you know, if divorce rates in some countries might be very low, not because people are happy, but because it's very difficult to get a divorce. So in a sense, when you're talking about these sort of much more sort of tactile statistics, it's quite hard to sort of build up a global picture. I think what you're saying, there would be a brilliant study for the UK or for Europe. And I think that in those areas where you have data, rich data, and you recognise that there are problems that can be addressed, or you recognise that there are positivities that you can measure, then I think that that's definitely true. But I mean, everybody obviously talks about this sort of like I heard the Orhan Pamuk comment earlier, which I've read that book. I'm not a massive fan of Orhan Pamuk, so but this cheery fatalism that you were describing, and also this sort of like sense of humour that people in Liverpool have, I think that's kind of true. But it's also true of anywhere. The further away from London you go in the UK, people have this perception of their city as offering these sort of Fortean truths which separate them from London. And because London is such an unfriendly place, people there, the first thing that people always say in any city, Birmingham, Manchester, you know, they always say that they have a sense of humour which separates them from London. And to a degree it's true, but it's kind of, a lot of cities have that sort of sense of self, and it usually is built around something like that. So it's interesting to see that, but I think that, you know, it also reflects the fact that because there's such a great degree of Londocentricity in the way that things are factored, people out in the provinces in Birmingham and in Liverpool, we're trying desperately to try and get recognised and try and get, you know, get noticed in a way. I think that's another challenge that I think we definitely have to face. I'm saying we. I do live in London, but, you know, we being from Birmingham, you know, I think that's definitely an important thing people need to think about.
Thanks very much. That was great. Yep.
My name is Christopher Jabot. I came to this city more than 20 years ago, and in the 90s I was part of the team of people who were trying to restore the reputation of Liverpool and Merseyside. And in 96 I wrote a report for the board of the Mersey Partnership, which was the organisation in those days who were doing what Liverpool Vision do today. And I had to make a report to the board about perceptions of the city and the area, and whether they were changing or not. And we were able to say, yes, they are. They are changing. Down there in London, there is some movement now. The investment markets are beginning to take notice. We can actually get them to talk about us. Sometimes we can get them to come up here. But I made another point, which was, I said, the thing that concerns me is I don't think we know who we are. I don't think as a city we know who we are. I don't think the community has any real sense of who we are and who we're going to be. Now, at the time, the board didn't do anything about that. Maybe they didn't want to look at that question too closely. And I've been out of that game for a long time, but I'm still here. And I've been a citizen of the city for 20 years. And I'm not sure we know any better today who we're going to be, who we want to be as a city. And it seems to me, my question to John, panel likewise, is that it seems to me incredibly important that a city should have some sense of who it wants to become. And presumably that factors into your surveys. And it seems to me that's the question that's still in front of Liverpool. We were a great port city. We were a gateway to empire. What are we today? Interesting that we're sponsored today by Peel, who've actually got a vision of restoring that gateway to empire thing. But I think that's very important. If a city wants to be able to stand on the world stage and say who it is, it's got to be pretty confident, and its citizens have got to be pretty confident about some way of articulating that, something that comes from the heart.
Well, I mean, I would agree. I would agree with what you're saying, but I would say that that's not necessarily going to relate to livability specifically. I think that's what's going to be driving a city's economy. So, you know, how a city wants to define itself is how it wants to define itself economically, the things that it wants to use to attract people to that city, whether it wants to be a hub for learning, whether it wants to be a port city, whether it wants to develop a manufacturing sector or a services sector. Those are all areas for town planning which don't necessarily relate directly into creating an aura of livability around a city. I think livability comes from that. I think that certainly once you've had your vision and you've set out your long-term strategy and you're working towards it, you will become more or less defined as more or less livable by the direction you're taking and how successful you are in it. I mean, if you look at many cities, they don't care about livability, and they're probably right not to, because at the end of the day, if you're a very successful city that's attracting huge amounts of you know, workers, migrant workers, or people coming in from the countryside or from where else, if your economy is thriving, if you're growing, then at the end of the day, livability becomes a secondary question. It certainly becomes an important one for the long term, and I think that infrastructure is certainly a key there on how cities deal with their growth. But for many cities, livability isn't something that they consider when they're looking to set out their identity. I think that you may be better finding that this is a question that's answered by our architect friend, because this sense of self and this sense of you know, defining oneself is obviously what's then going to be how a city then plans for its future.
Nick, you wanted everything.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree on one level. I think if you're looking at this in terms of the economic development of Liverpool and where the economy is going to be headed, then I think, you know, we know better now than we've known, I would say, any time since the 1950s or 60s, where we're headed as a city. If you look at what's happening over the next few weeks with IFB, if you look at, you know, Port and Maritime last week, if you look around knowledge economy, if you look at visitor economy, if you look at life sciences, all of these different themes are uniquely related to Liverpool. The combination of those together and what they bring to the city is unique to Liverpool. And I think we know better now than we've known before. I certainly think that, you know, when I go out and I speak to young people in Speke or in North Liverpool or in Toxteth, they know where they're headed. They know where the city's economy is headed, and that's a good thing. You know, on a much higher philosophical level on that, do we know what we are as a city? You know, I don't know. There's maybe others better placed than me, you know, to answer that. But certainly in terms of where we're headed economically as a city and what we want to do, and I think, you know, the whole issue around, you know, quality of life and economic growth, you know, we certainly see the two as being linked. If we just go for growth, if we just focus on quality of life alone and not focus on growth, then we're not going to get anywhere. We need to focus on the two, because that's where I think we've got the strongest and distinctive offer. We're growing as an economy, we've got some great prospects in there, and it's a fantastic place to live.
Just very quickly, as an outsider, but a Geordie, I think it's really quite interesting, because I think at the moment all of the great, particularly the great northern industrial cities, are struggling to find their identity. And in many ways, all of them are achieving degrees of success, but they're all stamping on the same territory. We're all trying to be the same thing in an odd sort of way. And when I was talking about reaching back into the DNA in relation to placemaking, I was really referring to the DNA in relation to the people who make up the city. And I think I think it is challenging. And I think also when I was talking about planning, one of the things that sort of struck me recently at an event I went to is that there is no plan, there is no Great Britain PLC plan that gives each of our regional cities a place in a UK context, which is extraordinary. You know, and I think, you know, some of that's got to come from the individual cities, some of it's got to come from a wider view, but you know, there is a colossal void there, I think, and there've got to be clues in relation to, you know, how we do really reinforce the identity and the uniqueness of each of our cities, which is too precious to lose.
I want to thank you very much for that question. I think we'll stop questions with that one because it was on a lot of different levels and the panel have begun to answer it. I'd like to think that we'll leave here with your question, and hopefully tonight will be part of, and it certainly engages mission, to continue raising questions and having good public debate, because discovering who we are and what our future is and where we want to go and what kind of city we want to build cannot be left to the planners, although we've got some really good planners, can't be left to the architects because they're all screwed by the developers, certainly can't be left to the developers because they, on the whole, only want to make a fast buck and are not interested in the much wider questions. And the politicians are in and out, aren't they? You vote them in one year and they're out the next, and city councils change, and, you know, all kinds of issues like that. The citizen, which you are and I am, and we are here, the citizen is the group of people that has to debate and has to find a forum where we can share these ideas and come to an agreed, not necessarily consensus, but an agreed understanding of who we are and where we want to go. And that is a process of more than one lifetime. But I think I'd like to draw Nick Small's comments. I think he's presenting very positively where the city is going and where we are. And I think we are in a new age, in a new time. I think the number of people we've got here tonight, the attendance that you've blessed us with tonight, is testimony to this is a city that is moving, that wants to engage. It wants to hear, you know, world-class speakers talking about things that matter. So my hope is that from tonight, we will have contributed something towards that whole issue of quality of life. And I'm delighted to hear that it's not just the economic issue that's the most important, but we have to find that balance. And while many of us are the citizens of the city centre, we've chosen to come and live in apartments here or in the beautiful Georgian quarter of the city centre, we also realise there are other areas that we need to push. So later on this year, Engage will have as its theme for our autumn seminar series, transport and mobility in the city centre for the 21st century. And we'll be bringing some comparator cities. We'll be bringing the mayor of Copenhagen and the chief planner from Copenhagen. We'll be bringing people from Bristol and Nottingham to talk about how they do the mobility and transport in their city, as well as a group from London coming in to critique what London does, even though they get 1 million times more spent per head of population than anywhere else in the country, to a scandalous degree. So we're not bringing anyone who can tell you how wonderful London is. We're bringing someone who can critique even the vast amounts of money being spent on each London citizen. So that's something to look forward to, because we want to continue improving the quality of life debate in the city, and how we get around our city, walking, cycling, public transport, is an issue that's really important, and we think it's very much on our agenda as city centre residents. So I want to thank tonight, as we draw this event to a close, our two main sponsors, Peel Group and Ryder Architecture. It's been wonderful. I'd like to thank Engage members and board members and our volunteers who have helped to make this event happen, particularly Andy Herring, who's been tweeting all the way through this event, who's been absolutely magnificent, and we really couldn't have run this event as well as we have tonight without Andy's incredible support. I'd like to thank Simon Savage from Liverpool Vision, who's been our coordinator for the IFB here, in the Cunard building, who's been marvellously putting with my hissy fits as numbers began to creep up over the weekend and we realized the room we had just wasn't going to be big enough. So it's been wonderful from Simon and his team. I'd like to thank Siren Catering from the Baltic, who prepared the food and the refreshments for tonight, and the staff of the Cunard building, who have been great. And then finally to thank each of you for attending and contributing so wonderfully to the debate tonight. I hope that we'll all take home a renewed determination to work at improving quality of life in all the places where we live and work. And finally, to thank John Copestake, our main speaker tonight, and our panellists, Alex, Nick, Paul, and Peter. So a final thank you to everyone on the stage for the work they've done. And thank you to you as well.